Hello there, and thanks for joining us this evening or lunchtime, wherever you are in the world. We're here tonight to talk about building regional esports ecosystems. Here in the UK, we've seen significant development over the last kind of like decade or so at many levels, mainly since the establishment of the British Esports Federation. However, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland are developing in their own way, and this session is going to focus on Scotland and what's happening in terms of competitive esports, education, and growth. And I'm joined by Mark McCready and Euan Jardine, and who I won't introduce. I will let them introduce themselves. And we're going to chat about all things esports in Scotland. And hopefully it'll give you kind of like some insight into what, like the differences of the way that areas and regions are developing their esports ecosystems, because it's actually quite interesting just in the UK. So if you then translate that to across the world, I think hopefully you'll find some interesting things to pick up on. So to start with, Mark, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi there. So yeah, Mark McCready. I've been working in the gaming esports space for the past 8 years. Starting out creating my own tournaments as a student at university, and then developing out my own esports club at the uni as well, in Edinburgh, and then over time participated with older organisations like Esports Scotland as a volunteer, looked at how we could have a bit more of a discussion nationally with Scotland. Worked at British Esports for about 2.5 years as well as their Scottish liaison officer. And then more recently, I'm a lecturer part-time at New College Lanarkshire, teaching on the esports programs as their specialist within the computing department, and setting up Scottish Esports as the national body for Scotland for gaming and esports.
Excellent. And Euan?
Yeah, hi, I'm Euan Jardine. I'm a councillor in Scottish Borders. I'm also the leader of Scottish Borders Council, but I'm an advocate for esports, and I see the value, I see the opportunity, and I see the future for our young people in education, and not so young people, that we can get established. It's interesting that Mark's on the call with me. We both got separate invites to come here, but me and Mark have worked together for about 7-8 years on esports, so we've both been part of the exact same journey. So hopefully we won't say the exact same things, but I think we've both helped each other in different spaces at different times. And obviously I met Nick for the first time at this Esports Scotland conference, which was a fantastic opportunity to discuss esports. But yeah, I'm looking forward to this and bring anything that I can in terms of what I've been able to do through government levels, etc.
Excellent. And I'd just like to sort of like talk about the reason why we're having this discussion tonight. And like Euan just said there, we had the first esports conference in Scotland at the back end of last year in Edinburgh, and it was a really insightful kind of event for myself. As the host, I had the privilege of bringing on and introducing all these great speakers, and then just sort of like chatting with people from education, from industry, from sport, and kind of, I've known Mark for quite a while. It was the first time I'd met Euan, and Euan's speech was quite inspiring, which is why I've invited them on this evening. And I think kind of like the conference there was kind of like potentially a landmark point for esports in Scotland, and then it brought together so many different communities. And like from your perspective, I think I'll start with you, Mark. You were obviously part of and worked within British Esports for a couple of years, as you've already said, and now you're heading up Scottish Esports. What was the turning point for you when you decided to step away from the BEF, set up your own thing, and like what are some of the reasons behind that?
I think it came down to a change in structure and policy within British Esports. There was a sort of divergence of their focus as an organization, but also for me taking the step to establish Scottish Esports was I tried to help from a UK level, but there was a lot happening at a national level within Scotland that with organizations and tournament organizers, there was a lot of distrust, particularly because of the history that existed there across with payments for players, with funding. My time at British Esports as their Scottish liaison officer, we set up the first education conference in Scotland at the time, and we invited colleges along, universities. We started rolling the discussion of this is what's happening in the rest of the UK, particularly in England. Wales had just recently set up Esports Wales at the time with John Jackson, and we weren't really looking at it really from a national ecosystem perspective. There was a lot of these pockets of grassroots communities. Some teams would pop up but then entirely disappear. So setting up Scottish Esports was a case of how can we start to build trust in community pillars across, so that we can establish that gaming and esports is an accessible activity for anybody of all ages to get involved with. And that really started when I was having that conversation initially with Euan when I went down to Gala Shields at the time. Previously in my role with British Esports, but then those discussions picked up and continued as I moved into supporting the development of Scottish Esports at the time too.
And how difficult has that initial journey been? Because it's always difficult when you start to set up something like that, and also kind of like just the processes and the things that you have to do, or the things that you should be doing as a governing body. How difficult has that been for you?
I think a lot of expectations out the door when you announce something like this. I think in the first few months, or the first month specifically, there's a lot of questions and eyes going, right, so what are you actually doing with this? And there was a lot of pressure of what do we need to produce out the gate. Really, it was to try and keep everything calm and settled and try to understand how we can build relationships, how we can advocate for it. So we set up initially as a national association. We still are, but we're slowly transitioning to more of a national governing entity, where we're looking towards clubs and how we can support club development across Scotland. But the challenges have been trying to do it the right way. And I think from starting this up just over a year ago, I wouldn't have sped anything up quicker, purely because we're trying to establish elements like safeguarding, code of conduct's best practice, helping support with templates and guidance around data and how they can implement some of these policies and meet Scottish legal standards at the same time, so that it can gain its professional recognition across the board, which, you don't want to rush a lot of these things. You do want to take that time. But there have been a lot of examples across the world. Between the time I left British Esports and set up Scottish Esports itself was about a year or two. And I had the chance to go to Sweden, Finland, Denmark, France, and be able to chat to some of the people that have been developing national ecosystems in very different ways. Some of the challenges they've had internally or domestic sort of back and forths, but also how we can uniquely set it up in Scotland as well, but also align across the UK at the same point. So trying to align, but also how do we make it fit for the Scottish market particularly?
Excellent. Yeah, and I can imagine like the conversations that you had with the people around Europe will be invaluable to you moving forward. And Euan, I remember your talk very vividly because it was so enthusiastic. So what I'd quite like you to just start with is kind of like talk about where your journey started and like the things that you saw, and then where that's led to, because like you've said and like Mark says, we both know, you're a real driver for esports in Scotland, and I think it's worth people kind of like hearing your side of the story, and because there's definitely lessons that people could learn if they're looking to do something similar elsewhere.
Yeah, no, thanks. And again, thanks for the opportunity to share once again the story of how I was able to get into esports and what I've done. So it started for me when I was in a previous role, manager in a previous role. Someone came in fresh out of school for a job interview, sat down and said, "Oh, I've got no qualifications." I said, "Okay, well, what do you like to do? What's your hobbies?" I'm a big believer in hobbies and pastimes. They actually sometimes create more opportunities for your life than educational ones, and I think that can really bring someone out. And he said to me, "I'm in one of the best teams in Europe for," I think the game, one of the games, I totally forget which game it was. I said, "Okay, we'll say Counter-Strike. He says, I'm one of the best players. And I'm like, okay, tell me more about that. It's just me and my friends were really good at it. We compete in competitions, etc. Okay, tell me, what do you do? Oh, he said, well, we stop. After the game, we analyze it. We sit there for 2 hours, going through each of our roles. We discuss our roles. I said, what do you mean your roles? Well, I've got a specific role in the game. My friend's got a specific role in the game. My other friend's got a specific role in the game. Okay, and are all these guys from Gala? Oh, no, they're from across Europe. So you're speaking to different people in different countries who are doing different roles and different things, and you don't understand that this is a skill set that you've got that we need in this company, where you can analyze, you can deliver. He went, no, I've got no qualifications. I'm not good at anything. I went, you're one of the best players in Europe at this game. Why is that not something you're good at? Anyway, we employed him. But that made me think, because after that, I was still basically doing the counsellor job and that role. And I left that role to take on the counsellor one full time. But then I started to deep dive into the world of esports, deep dive into say, okay, what's this computer game? So for me, it was very different. I think, like, you'll remember now, Mark might be way too young for this. When we wanted to play with our friends on the computer, we would have to sit in the exact same room as them, talking to them. There was no, all of a sudden I realized people could talk through a headset. They could do that. And the games, I didn't have to wait to go buy a game. The game was there. You could download it instantly to your, then you could play microtransactions. It was a whole world that opened up for me there. Then I got really into the best game in the world, in my opinion, Fortnite. I was playing that and I was looking at the whole ecosystem. But then that turned out to be the exact same time as the Fortnite World Cup, where Booga won in Arthur Ashe Stadium. And I remember looking, going, he's in that premier tennis stadium that US Open's played, but they're playing Fortnite. And the whole thing around it, there was the creative, etc., etc. So I went, right, this is a world that I don't know anything about. So I dived and I learned Fortnite, played it. And then the more I looked at it, and I went, actually, this is something we need to do. So that's when I got in touch with Mark. Mark came down, and then we just talked about, actually, how can we start delivering this in schools? How can this be a tool for good, not a force where people think, oh, esports, we don't want them playing computer games, we need to ban computer games. No, you're not going to ban it. You're not going to get them off it. But how can we instill habits around it? Let them know they've got skills while they're doing it, that they can take into the workplace, take into other educational settings out there, and just create this whole community of people who's exact same minded as them. And they could be boys, they could be girls, they could be 16, they could be 11, they could be whatever age, but they're working together in the school because they know they've got one passion and one ability, and who's the best at it, but who's not the best at it, and a whole created around. So yeah, so that for me was a passion. I could see the opportunity, and it's the future. But you can't kick back on the future. You have to embrace it and see how you can help shape them with a culture that you need.
And did you find it kind of like difficult to convince other people in your sphere of the importance of esports, or did they generally, jump on board?
Oh yeah, absolutely. People they don't understand it, and there are people still not understand it. But I continue to talk about it, continue to push with it, and there's a generation that doesn't understand it. And I say that to them, just because you don't understand it doesn't mean there's a whole generation that doesn't understand it, because they will come through and they will know what you're talking about. They will know all the things that are going on. And you have to be, as a counsellor, as a politician, as any people who's creating policy, think about everybody when you're shaping policy, not just a niche view. And I think I talked about at the conference how there was one counsellor in particular, never mind esports, he said to me once, what's a Netflix? So he didn't even know what Netflix was, never mind esports or computer games. So a lot of this is very alien to them. We introduced iPads to every child. Some of them are still saying, well, pads and pen. Why don't we just have a pad and pen? I went to school with a pad and pen. Well, the world's changed dramatically since the days of the invention of the pad and the pen. So it's how do we continue to do it? And so we're excited because we are at the front of it. And so because we're at the front, we've learned mistakes that we've jumped hurdles that others don't need to jump. We can put them in there. But at the same time, we now have an opportunity. And for me, that's what it's about. It's creating opportunity for the region, but for our young people and not so young people in the region. And I love what Mark's saying, because that's something me and him have always talked about, is that club network. I come from a traditional sports background. And for me, the club network is where everything can really thrive. So yeah, that's something I'm keen for.
Excellent. And you mentioned schools, and we'll go on to talk a bit about education later on. I think education is really important. And Mark, like from somebody who was effectively on the inside at British Esports, education played a huge part in the growth and awareness for British esports. Like, would you agree with that? Do you think that was kind of like that was what catapulted them to the next level?
I think when you're talking about anything that's a new concept, you have to start with education, and you've got to be able to digest it down. And because to anybody that's new, kind of what Euan was saying there about the pad and pen is okay. We can start with the pad and pen example, but this can do a lot more than just sketching or writing with a pencil and a pad. It has a lot more uses to it, and I think with gaming, you have to take that concept that I think within esports we talk a lot about the competitive side and the pro players and the large amounts of money, but I think from our side is very much, or what we've been trying to do at Scottish Esports is it's about people that are coming together to play games, to hang out with one another, where whether it is in the same room, whether it's online, whether it's with people across Europe, and it's how do you start to break that down to people that don't quite understand that concept of, wait, what do you mean that you're playing with someone in France? You have to get a passport to go to France, and you can't just hop over the river. Or you're playing with somebody in America, or you're watching this streamer and you're watching them play, for example, Ninja with Fortnite, or any of the pro players for Valorant, etc. You're watching them break down their skills, or you might be just watching specific maps, breaking down their tactics, how they communicate that. I think that was one of the things that British Esports did really well, was the education and how they communicated the message of esports. And I think with what they've done with Pearson, we've been trying to do quite heavily with SQA in Scotland, which is sort of totally different network as well.
Yeah, and I think you've hit two really good points there. And the first one being that sort of like competitive nature. Everybody likes competing. Everybody likes kind of like that competition. And the fact that you can take part in a national competition relatively simply, you know, like from your college, from your school, your university, etc., and compete against all of those other colleges and schools around the country in a national tournament that you can then go on and qualify for the finals or whatever and win a national competition, is something that is quite unique to esports. And when you're talking about football, yes, there are those things, but it's so much more difficult and complicated, and the logistics and the expense of travel and all of those sorts of things, which is one of those beautiful things that esports has that many other traditional sports don't have. I also think kind of like what you were saying about like education and awareness, that's something that I've learnt over the last 10 years. I've been working in esports and education for kind of in my 11th year. And 11 years ago, we were putting on sessions for local school groups and local community groups. And they would come into our center and kind of like play competitive tournaments, Fortnite or whatever, or they'd come in and we'd teach them sort of transferable skills like video production, but we would use like Minecraft as the vehicle. So, they'd learn how to write a script, they'd learn how to set characters, design sets, and they would build the sets in Minecraft, create the characters in Minecraft, record the moving image within the game, and then do voiceovers and sound effects and all of those things. So they were learning all of those production skills through a medium that they were comfortable with and enjoyed, which is another advantage of esports and gaming, is that we can take education into the world that they already exist in. But I remember the conversations I had 11 years ago with parents. My son, wow, it's just gaming, isn't it? No, it's not just gaming. And well, what careers are there? Well, there's all sorts of careers. And we used to use the analogy of the World Cup, like football, soccer. The final of the World Cup is watched by millions and millions of people around the world. You've got a stadium full of 60,000 people, but you've got all of those other elements that make all of that happen, like broadcast and cybersecurity, IT, networking, branding, merchandise, ticket sales, lighting, you know, all of those kind of things. And all you really have to do is, if you just take off the 11 players on the pitch, put a big stage in the middle of that stadium and put on 2 teams with computers competing on games with big screens, you have exactly the same ecosystem. And it was very hard 11 years ago to get that through. And a lot of people kind of like didn't really believe it. And I'd been doing that for probably 3 or 4 years before British Esports sort of like came to Providence, and the BTEC was, the qualification was launched. And then I went through the same journey with parents coming into the college to ask about esports as a qualification, and what's this, how does this work? And a lot of them were quite sarcastic. I would say, like, within 2 years, that approach or that kind of attitude from the parents completely changed. And I think that forever continues. And, you know, another advantage is the fact that a lot of the parents of those youngsters game themselves. So they get the gaming bit. They just never really appreciated or recognized what the gaming side and what esports could do for their children in terms of potential education. Euan, going back to your the points that you raised earlier. So having established that and kind of like seeing that interest and recognizing all of the opportunities that are available from a political point of view, what was the strategy? Kind of, you know, where, because I'm assuming you had to sort of like sit and have a think about the best way to approach this. What did that look like?
Yeah, so we were really blessed. I talked about giving an iPad to every young person in the Scottish borders. They all got an iPad, and from there we built up a place called Inspire Learning. Inspire Learning was this brand new building, it's new area, but it was a brand for these Apple computers, that iPads. We were able to establish teacher training, and one of the teachers there who was part of it was a guy called Paul Graham, fantastic individual. I worked with him, and we said, right, let's put esports in to the Inspire Learning part of the education. So it's not being seen as an educational thing in terms of regular education. It's actually going into the Inspire Learning, but it's kind of futuristic. It's about the day. It's about different ways of delivering education in a futuristic, you know, fit for the future type situation. So Paul, we worked with Paul back and forth, delivered a pilot in Selkirk, a fantastic pilot in Selkirk. If I maybe have to, I'll share the BBC article. The BBC did a big program on it, and it's the young people there, the stories there. There was a young man that went to the esports club. He had no attainment at all. He was skipping school, he was cutting class, he had no qualifications. He went to the esports club, really enjoyed it, then started going to maths, then started going to English, then started going to geography, and then got qualifications. Attainment shot right up because of that one hook of the esports club. He didn't want to miss that, so he knew he had to go to the rest. And because he grew his confidence there, got to meet people he didn't really usually talk to there, he was able to do it. So that's one story, but there's a whole host of other stories. And then we started to hold little regional tournaments as well for some of the schools. So some of the schools didn't even have an esports team, but we got them involved in other ways. And now we have made it up that every school's got an esports club. Every school is now going to be getting there, and we have more and more tournaments coming. So it's about taking that one little pilot and continuing to keep the pressure on. So Paul, is what happens at councils, officers do a lot of the work, a lot of the groundwork, but I'm there to keep going, pushing a policy, delivering a policy. Okay, this needs to happen. Oh, Paul, you've got a problem. Let me go help you solve that. Let me speak to the right people. Let me make that happen. And of course, there's resistance. And also, we've just created a sports strategy. And I think we are the first council in Scotland to have esports as part of our sports and physical activity strategy, which to me is a huge deal because it's now seen in the same way as traditional sports. We're a huge traditional sports area. But I've said that esports, it's there because we can help people shape to get physically active while utilising that and not demonising it, because that's a problem. I think there's a demonisation of esports in computer games. Actually, no, they can be effective tools for bigger and better things in communities.
And I suppose this question could go to either of you. Is there a particular kind of like centre that is leading the way in Scotland? You know, and kind of like, and if so, what is it that they're doing that others aren't, that people can aspire to? You know, obviously you're kind of like, Mark, you're in that in that boat in terms of leading the way on a sort of like national level. But is there any specific examples that you can think of, or that you might want to offer as somebody who's leading the way?
Yeah, I could take that one. I think one of the strengths that we've got is there's fantastic individuals across the board in different sectors leading the way on it, and it isn't just one person. And I can't sit here and take credit, because I think it's everybody around that's been setting the groundwork and enabling for something like Scottish Esports to exist. It's people like Euan that's on the call that help make it happen within the council, and particularly Scottish Borders, and helping drive those conversations. Paul from helping deliver those pilots. Paul's now sits on our board as our education director now. So I think the one thing that has been really strong is we've all seeked ways to collaborate together, and I think that's been the strength along the way. And I know we're a bit late to the game with everything, but I think even Emma Williamson from YMCA Wishaw and Brave Esports from the youth work development side of it. We've even got a degree program in Dundee and Angus College that has implemented the SQAs, created the MPA with stakeholders from across industry and educators across the levels as well, to understand how we can package these up and provide it out. I think there's a lot of key individuals that we can point to, even your fighting game communities. I think we've learned a lot from trying to understand from a club perspective of what needs to be there at the core to harness a sort of true esports, if there is such a thing, audience, because they're the biggest esports in Scotland is by far the FGC. They're the most organised, they collaborate, they talk to each other. I think, yeah, there are a lot of really great examples, and I think that's something that I'm hoping, how can we keep continuing to collaborate, and as people push on with what Euan's doing, with what the YMCA is doing as well, now expanding out across all of the YMCAs in Scotland, this is a point where we're now starting to see a national change, and how we can start to pinpoint what Scottish Borders has been doing, what YMCA has been doing with youth work across the education sector, as well as schools, colleges, and then the university input where it is as well, and how we can start to build that ecosystem together. So I think, yeah, sorry, might have cut into you there as well, Euan, but yeah, I think there's been a lot of people that have led the way in this.
Yeah, and Euan, what about your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think Mark's obviously he's very much deep into it than I am, and at a national level, I'm very focused. I mean, in my region, but for me, I think it's still very young in terms of what the potential is, and I think there's still that misunderstanding. So I'm working. I had a meeting yesterday with Public Health Scotland, and I said to them they need to be starting to look at esports. I met with the Scottish Government. That's when I said, and so from my point of view, I don't think there is enough people talking about it to government. I think that still needs to be there. I think government, in terms of pinpointing who to speak to, what to speak to, they'll hear one voice, but they're not hearing the right voices sometimes. And I think that's a big issue. That's a big problem. So it's about how can I enable that? How can I speak to others to enable, so we can get the likes of Mark and others just in front of government, in front of policymakers, and to go, no, this isn't a fad. This isn't something. This can be, pardon upon, a game changer in education. It can be a game changer for people there, because, so for me, yeah, there's still a lot of work to be done, but I think there's a lot of great work being done. Mark's right, it's not just one person, it's a whole collective. But how can we make sure we are getting the right people at the right time, speaking to the right people? And I think sometimes it hives off to one person will say, I'll go do the talking. No, actually, you might not be the right person. Somebody else might be able to do that. So I think that's really...
As well with what you're saying there as well, Euan, recently in the past week, the National Game Strategy has just been launched and handed to the Scottish Government, and I now believe it's been put forward as a motion to be debated in the Scottish Parliament in the coming weeks. A section of that, it actually described gaming as a social force for good, and talked about its level of engagement across entertainment being larger than film, music, TV combined. So to have that level of engagement, and to still not have any sort of recognition at a government level. I think there's really strong cases that
Yes.
gaming exists across the world. There's a minimum digital living standard as well, that was developed out of the Institute in Manchester, in Salford, and that's now being used, saying a games console is a minimum digital living standard for people that live in poverty. This is something that they recognise is a necessity in this economy that we currently live in. And if you don't have access to a game console, that's a sign of deprivation. So I think there's a lot of work, and we're already starting to pinpoint in some of these plans. But it kind of goes back to the work that Brian's been doing or Brian Baglow has been doing with the Scottish Games Network in the plan, is how do we start to map and connect all these up? Right now they're isolated, it's game development. How do we get esports in? How do we get the wider gaming in and connect it up with entrepreneurship and media production, etc., with what you were saying earlier, Nick?
Yeah, and I think you've mentioned a few different kind of like things and kind of like benchmarks. And if you look at the 21st century skills framework, you know, esports literally ticks so many of those boxes with all of the transferable skills and digital literacy and all of those things that, you know, is now being used as a common benchmark. And, you know, I think we're potentially missing out because we know and understand this. It's like you said, Euan, it's about the right people talking to the right people, you know, and those people with the knowledge often don't get in front of the high level officials that they need to kind of get these points across. Whereas within education, we're acutely aware of all of these things and are working towards it. And you mentioned Scottish qualifications, Mark. Now, both of us have been working with those guys for the last year to develop new qualifications. Now, that's obviously a good thing, you know, and it's great that they've taken that on board. And you know, they had representatives attended the conference in Edinburgh. Do you think, kind of like from that perspective, this is a pivotal point in the journey? Because if Scottish qualifications establish the rest, so they already have a qualification, but more qualifications, and it becomes like a stable body, at that point, is that when it's much easier for other people and outsiders and government to recognize that this is a thing?
Well, I think the SQA qualifications, I think their biggest qualification that they've got right now is the MPA esports, which is from an SCQF level 4 to 6, or the RQF 1 to 3. Might be wrong on that one. You might know better, Nick. But that qualification, in comparison to some of the other qualifications that have been delivered in other parts, is a very small qualification, and it's been quite condensed down to the point it can be delivered in schools. And it can be delivered in schools alongside students doing their national fives or national fours, national fives, hires, advanced hires as well. So it's now a bite sized down, where we've now got young people across Scotland that have never heard of esports before, see it on their timetable and go, actually, kind of what's that? Oh, it's gaming and esports, like competitive video gaming. They have the chance now to learn about the entire industry with all the different creative outlets as well, typically similar to what you would have with PE, where you would go and learn about football, hockey, tennis, or badminton. It's a way of actually understanding the digital side. And a lot of councils, and particularly, I know the challenges with networking, etc., at schools, and also the borders I've had with that, but I've found solutions. Is how do we start to implement the networking elements and making it more accessible across? But I think that's been a really strong suit, is the fact that over 50 centres, secondary schools and colleges in Scotland are now delivering the MPA across the level 4 to 6, and not including the HNC and now the HND that's in development. I think it sets the tone, and I think that's where we're seeing we need to be supporting the education sector more, providing resources, toolkits, letting people know what's happening across, and telling the history of the people that have been developing it out, and building the community scenes, so that the right information is going down, so students know where to go for that advice, whether it is through the council with the local activities they're doing, and then up to a national level.
I think one kind of like positive spin on that, if you like, is the way that the English qualifications developed in terms of esports, in the fact that it really started. Yes, there were a couple of universities delivering kind of quite specialist esports qualifications, and then the BTEC was launched at college level for 16 to 18-year-olds, which has obviously exploded over the last 5 or 6 years, and we've now got like 10,000 students studying it, which has then led to now having 32 universities offering 76 different esports degrees. And the filter is now working back down into schools. So it's kind of like working in the other way to what it did at Scotland, in that the schools are in there first. And then sort of like, as that grows and develops, you've then got the qualifications that are now being developed and coming in at the higher levels for the youngsters to progress in. So that kind of like awareness at school level is really good. And like you just said, the competitive side of it and the esports clubs and all of those, I think probably Scotland is potentially comparative, in a equivalent sort of like size comparison, is on a par with England in that area, if not at the same stage, sort of like a while back, are ahead. So I think that's got a lot of potential going forward. From your perspective, Euan, what do you think is kind of like the next stage, the next phase? Like, what's in your kind of like strategy for continued growth and expansion?
Yeah, it's what I sort of discussed at the start is getting into that club base, creating these esports clubs outside of the school environment. So your local sports club, I said, for us in the Scottish Borders, we have a rich tradition in traditional sports, rugby clubs, football clubs. Can we get esports clubs onto these clubs, get people along to watch the sport, get people to watch esports, and get them all working together, sharing their identity? For me, that's there. And if we can start doing it in the Scottish Borders, let's start rolling it out across the rest of Scotland and see what we can do, because that's where it's going to come. And then when you've got the esports clubs, you're not just potentially having the young people there, you're having different people in society, and it's community cohesion. And that's the big buzzwords at the moment through government, is community cohesion. People coming together from different sectors of society, actually working together and realizing we've got more in common than we don't have in common. And I think that's a real key part. And I think esports can be an enabler of bringing people together. I talk about when I used to play basketball, you would have on the Thursday night playing basketball, someone from Lithuania, someone from Russia, someone from Poland, someone from, I think Kenya was there. There was someone from Ghana was there, and I think I was the most less international person there. It was just everybody was different, but you were all talking to each other. You were all playing that one game, and when you saw each other down the street, you would speak to each other. Otherwise, you would not do that. So for me, I think esports has got that to bring communities together, and I think that's really important. You can have community competitions, but that's where I see, for me, an ecosystem in the Scottish Borders. It's clubs to take it. Then we start the elite player pathway. Once you get that elite player pathway, then you then go on to the better teams, and then there's the opportunities for careers in esports. And people generally seen playing, but then it's not just the people playing. They need coaches, they need announcers, they need editors, they need graphic designers, they need the whole market. And I think that's what we need. But until you create that elite player pathway and people know they can slide into that pathway, it's going to be difficult to sell the bigger ecosystem. But yeah, once you create the pathway, then you've got different pathways that can stream off it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on. There's not much more I can add to that. I've got a question that's come through on the comments from George Lewin, and it's to you, Mark. Do you use any other esports bodies as a guide to help build Scottish esports, or is it purely run off what you guys think is best and what others do as well?
I think a lot of it's been modelled off of comparing existing models across. From having the chance to speak to people setting up different organizations, they've had their own individual struggles of just trying to gain the recognition or connect with the players, the clubs. We talked about education there, local government as well. There's unique circumstances, and I think that's something we've had to take on from the committee side, is trying to understand, or from our board, sorry, is how can we navigate and structure that in Scotland. I think we've been very fortunate that we've had that collaboration from the early days and talking and knowing faces and understanding how we can work together. One of the models that we have looked at and speak to quite regularly is John Jackson from Esports Wales. Sort of a no-brainer. Collaboratively across the UK, we want to support the development of esports, being two national bodies that function solely within the home nations. We want to find ways that can we save us doing double the work, essentially. Is there ways that we can learn from how they've developed, some of the stumbles that they've come across, some of the issues that they've had to take head on, and learn how can we implement that into Scotland. I think sort of like what you've said there as well, we've sort of came from this grassroots up, so the sort of bottom up approach rather than from this top down, how you said about like universities and the education side, or having standout esports professional teams that are competing at the top. We have a lot of fantastic esports players, coaches that have won world titles, but we've also had conversations with them to understand what is actually needed, how can we get to this point. And yeah, I think going from the bottom up means things get done a bit slower, but hopefully we're doing it in the best way that we possibly can as well. But you have to communicate with others.
Yeah, that's really good. And that kind of like leads directly into a follow-up question from George, where he talks about kind of esports being seen as a proper sport. But I think this is probably more directed at you, Mark, but I'm sure Euan can chip in. How do you plan on helping grassroots teams build as a big entity? You've just mentioned grassroots, and obviously that's the structure that you're looking to do, build it from the bottom up. So what have you got in mind in terms of kind of like helping to build the grassroots scene?
I think it kind of comes back to that point Euan mentioned about the community cohesion. How do we, whether it's a sport or not, the way that I've seen it is it's an activity. So we have to represent it as an activity, whether it fits as a sport, whether it doesn't. Those are different discussions on top. But first and foremost, we want to start representing gaming and esports. I think one of the big concerns is around how gaming is conducted online anyways. And a lot of the feedback conversations we've had is about the risks. How do we reassure parents? How do we start having some of the serious conversations around the elements like safeguarding? Something that's changed in the past year in Scotland is the legal requirement that if you work with vulnerable groups, you must have a PVG in place. That applies to people within roles online that are in a position of power or influence in a regulated role. That means someone running an esports club online, they need to have a PVG in place, or what would be a DBS check equivalent in England. That's the place that we're starting with in trying to create an entry level so that we can build that support, ensure that clubs are going to the right places to get the support, whether that is Disclosure Scotland, working with ourselves from an esports perspective and building that network up, and then trying to learn off of good practice as well. Sort of referral process, how do we do appeal systems? I think there's a lot we could explain out, but it's trying to start at the beginning, and it's the safeguarding, just ensuring that we're creating safe spaces across for people to engage with in the beginning, and then have those conversations with member clubs about that development path and how we can best support players from a competitive angle. As long as they're safe first, we can look at the competitive angle as we progress.
And that's really good to hear. And I think you've explained perfectly what you mean about building it from the grassroots, and that having everything in place, having everything proper, having that structure, those policies, the safeguarding, so that everybody knows that they're on a fair playing field, and parents can trust that system, educators can trust that system. I think that was a really good response, Mark. Okay, so we're coming to the end now. I think probably the final sort of like question to both of you guys, and you can go first, whoever wants to go first. So where esports is right now in Scotland is where it's at. Where do you see it going? How quick, what's that time frame looking like? and what's the next most important step? You know, what's the kind of what's going to be the clincher to really kind of kick things off?
I'm happy to go first since Mark had a couple of questions there. For me, the next important step for esports is people see it as a legitimate thing in the country. At the moment, there is that misconception around it. And to get that legitimacy, you need to tie, you've obviously got in the governing body now, but then you need to start working through policy, and it's not just through my council, through every other council, through government. You need to start working for government, and you need to be seen in the hierarchy. And when Sports Scotland or whoever start to dish out their money, esports needs to be on that list, along with croquet, along with badminton, along with tennis. Esports should sit there, because it's got the right ecosystem. And I think that's right, but you're building it from grassroots. It takes a little bit longer, but I think you're going to build it better because of that. But it's taken learning from other sports. But I think that's, for me, is you just need that legitimacy. There can't be any more myths around it. They all need to be taken away, the myths, and we need to know this is something that's here. This is something that's not going away. And to do that, you just need to become legitimate, and that's having the conversations, and it's getting that government buy into it. So that's what I think.
Excellent. That almost sounds like it could be Scottish Esports mission statement, Mark.
I think so. I think so. We just after phase, we held our second Scottish Esports in Education mini conference, and just thinking back to 2024 when we launched and we held our first one, I remember outlining in a slide of how were we building this from the beginning, and it was education. It was a case of how can we ensure that the qualifications are there, how can we work with the educators, how can we work with local authorities to support the education infrastructure, because having access to the hardware, the networking, what games to put into place. And I think there's a network there around educators themselves now, and wanting to develop that out, and that's something we've got those plans set out of how to represent them. Youth work, I mentioned about earlier, YMCA has been doing a lot with Emma through the Brave Esports and what she's done there, who've went on to compete in the RLCS Europe EU qualifiers and nearly made it to a major in Denmark, which coincidentally I was also going to that major, so that would have been a nice little see. I think it's building on those pillars that we've got as the education, the youth work, and the community stuff with young people. Essentially in Scotland, by the end of this year, they're going to have a qualification up to the age of 18. There's Minecraft competitions being done in primary schools with local authorities. So they've got an activity extracurricularly up till 18. There's a qualification when they turn essentially 15 to 18, and then going into further education and then university pathways. In the community, they've got their YMCAs, so they've got their after school clubs that they can go along to through youth work. I think it comes back to what Euan's saying there is what happens when they're 18 and we're going to specifically esports stuff as well, when they're going to community clubs and also outside of the youth club side as well, that they're dedicated esports spaces. How do we support people that are wanting to work closer with young people that have traditionally worked with 18 plus because they haven't been confident around the safeguarding issues and how they can implement gaming and esports safely. I think that's the next step for us, and I think that will help build those arguments towards government.
Brilliant. I'm sure this conversation could carry on for another hour. I'd like to thank both of you, Mark and Euan, for a fantastic discussion, and it's great to see the passion and the commitment and the development of esports in Scotland that's going with it. And hopefully people listening to today will be able to take some key lessons and learn some things about, what they might need to do or things to think about if they're looking to build that esports ecosystem in their region. And finally, it's just to wrap up. I have to remind you, don't forget, it's Esports Next 2026 is fast approaching. Save the date. It's April the 29th to the 30th. Fort Worth, Texas, under the theme Rival the Best, Rule the Rest. The premier US business-to-business esports conference takes place alongside Blast Premier Rivals Tournament. If you want to find out more about that event and find out why you should join the Esports Trade Association, go to esportsa.org. That's esportsa.org. And finally, for the members, for you members who are already there, you will soon be receiving a survey that we'd really appreciate you to complete. And it's about content and what's important to you. The Education Committee want to find out what's important to you, the things that you want to know about, so that we can put some things together to give to our members as open access free resources like we usually do. So look out for that, and it'll take you 3 minutes to complete, and we'd really appreciate it. So for now, thanks to Mark, thanks to Euan. I hope you've enjoyed the LinkedIn Live, and we'll look forward to the next one in March, and we'll see you then.
Thank you.